On May 1st, 2022, tragedy struck in Clinton, Mississippi, when the lifeless body of Bobby Davis was discovered at the home of his girlfriend, Shadow Robinson. The details surrounding the murder would become the focus of a complex investigation, one that would unravel a tale of jealousy, betrayal, and conflicting testimonies. The key to solving the case lay with a man named William Napoleon Polo Edwards, a man who would eventually find himself at the center of the legal storm, facing charges of murder. The murder and initial investigations. Bobby Davis was shot multiple times at Shadow Robinson's house, located in a quiet residential neighborhood. The events leading up to the shooting remained shrouded in mystery for some time. However, there was little doubt that this was no random act of violence. Law enforcement officials quickly ruled out the possibility of a random shooting, though it remained unclear whether Bobby Davis was specifically targeted. The investigation led authorities to believe that something more personal was at play, and this suspicion would soon point to Polo Edwards. Detectives in Clinton were initially puzzled when they discovered that Polo's name had come up in a 911 call made shortly after the shooting. The lead detective, upon hearing Polo's name mentioned, assumed that the radio host might have been the victim. This led him to make an urgent call to Polo, who answered, creating a series of phone calls between them in the hours following the murder. Polo, who had been in contact with law enforcement for several hours, agreed to turn himself in. However, he delayed for days, reportedly making a series of mysterious trips during this time. It wasn't until Polo had traveled north and south, ultimately making his way to New Orleans, that he was arrested. When taken into custody, Polo maintained his innocence, adamantly denying any involvement in Bobby Davis's death. He was questioned about the incident, but he insisted that he had no role in it. His responses, however, were not enough to convince authorities, and his actions, coupled with the evidence, would soon tell a different story. A troubled relationship. A closer look at Polo and Shadow Robinson's relationship revealed a deep-seated tension and emotional turmoil. Shadow had been in a rocky, on-again, off-again relationship with Polo, which had grown increasingly toxic over time. Polo had made countless attempts to connect with Shadow, pursuing her through social media for years before they developed a romantic relationship. But the relationship was strained from the start, with Shadow feeling that Polo was overly possessive and controlling. According to Shadow's testimony, Polo had tried to re-enter her life, despite their separation. She recounted incidents where Polo would appear unannounced at her home, bringing gifts for her children in an attempt to win her back. These gestures, however, were not well received, and Shadow made it clear that she did not want to continue the relationship. Polo's emotional state, according to Shadow, was fragile. He had become deeply jealous of anyone else she spent time with, including her friends and, ultimately, Bobby Davis. In the days leading up to the murder, Polo sent Shadow a series of increasingly erratic messages. One message included a photo of the two of them together, taken months earlier when Shadow had been unaware of the photo being taken. Polo also sent Shadow a chilling warning: "You're going to wish you played this game on someone else." Shadow testified that the situation had escalated to the point where she feared for her safety. She described how, on the afternoon of May 1st, 2022, Polo appeared at her home, uninvited. Bobby Davis, Shadow's boyfriend, was present at the time, cooking in the kitchen. Shadow went to the kitchen, confused about why Polo was there, and asked Bobby, "Why is Polo pulling up in my driveway?" Bobby had responded, but before they could discuss it further, the situation rapidly escalated. As Shadow testified, she heard gunshots, rapid, non-stop firing, and immediately ran to find Bobby. What she discovered was horrifying. Bobby lay on the ground, face down in the hallway, while Polo stood over him. She watched in shock as Polo placed the gun in his waistband and left the scene. This testimony became one of the most critical pieces of evidence in the case, as Shadow was the only witness to the murder. However, her credibility would soon be questioned in court. The investigation and evidence. Despite Polo's insistence on his innocence, the evidence mounted against him. The investigation into the crime scene was thorough, but there were no clear answers at first. Law enforcement found 6 spent shell casings at the scene, but the results from forensic analysis were inconclusive. 2 of the bullets recovered from Bobby's body were traced to a 9mm firearm, while the remaining 7 bullets failed to match anything conclusively. A search of Shadow's home occurred just days after the murder. While Shadow denied owning any firearms, investigators found 9mm ammunition inside her home. This was significant because, with her criminal history, she was prohibited from possessing any firearms. Shadow, however, insisted that the ammunition did not belong to her. Another search took place at Polo's residence in Jackson, Mississippi, where police discovered a 9mm gun case containing live rounds, but no weapon. It was clear that Polo was somehow linked to the crime, but the murder weapon was never found. Further complicating the case was Polo's behavior in the days following the shooting. He had embarked on an unexplainable road trip to New Orleans, which raised suspicions. Investigators also searched the black Ford F-450 pickup truck Polo had been driving at the time. The truck was owned by a friend, but Polo had been using it for several months. Inside the truck, investigators found more 9mm ammunition, but still no weapon. Polo's cell phone data played a crucial role in the investigation. Despite his insistence that he was at home in Jackson at the time of the shooting, cell tower records placed his phone leaving Jackson around 5:00 p.m. on the day of the murder. The phone was traced traveling toward Clinton, where the last location recorded just before the shooting placed it just 4 blocks from Shadow's house. A nearby witness, Wayne Derrick, also provided testimony that placed a black pickup truck at the scene. Derrick heard gunshots and saw the black truck speeding away from the location. The evidence was beginning to point toward Polo as the perpetrator, despite his continued claims of innocence. The trial. When the case went to trial in the summer of 2023, Polo's defense team argued that he was being framed and made a scapegoat. The defense emphasized that the case relied heavily on the testimony of Shadow Robinson, the only witness who identified Polo as the shooter. They also raised questions about the credibility of Shadow's account, given her history with the victim and her involvement in another violent incident years earlier. In 2001, Shadow had shot and killed her ex-boyfriend, Leno Moore, during an altercation in her apartment. This past history of violence, combined with inconsistencies in her testimony, made her an unreliable witness in the eyes of the defense. They questioned why Shadow had not been investigated as a potential suspect, given her presence at the scene and the fact that she had been the one to accuse Polo. On cross-examination, the defense sought to discredit Shadow's version of events. They pointed out inconsistencies in her testimony, such as the way she described Polo handling the firearm after the shooting. Shadow had claimed that Polo placed the gun in his waistband after firing several shots, but the defense suggested that this wouldn't have been impossible due to the heat of the gun after firing multiple rounds. The defense also questioned Shadow's possession of Bobby Davis's cell phone, which had been found at her home after the shooting. Shadow initially denied knowing where the phone was, but police later found it in her closet. The defense argued that this raised further doubts about her credibility. Despite these challenges, the prosecution's case was bolstered by cell phone data, eyewitness testimony, and the physical evidence found at the scene. Shadow's testimony was corroborated by multiple sources, including Wayne Derrick, the neighbor who had seen the black pickup truck leave the scene. The trial of William Napoleon Polo Edwards ended with a conviction. The jury found him guilty of the murder of Bobby Davis, largely based on the testimonies, forensic evidence, and cell phone data that placed him at the scene. While Shadow Robinson's credibility was questioned, her account of the events, along with other corroborating evidence, made it clear that Polo had been the one responsible for the fatal shooting. Polo's defense, which tried to point to Shadow as the true culprit, ultimately did not convince the jury. Instead, it was Polo's own actions, including his erratic behavior in the days following the murder and the evidence linking him to the crime, that sealed his fate. As a result, William Polo Edwards was sentenced for his role in the murder, and the case served as a sobering reminder of the consequences of unchecked jealousy and violence.